My name is David, and for 12 long years I served as an elder in the Jehovah's Witnesses organization. Today, I'm going to tell you the secret they desperately tried to make me hide. A secret so dangerous that it cost me everything I thought mattered in life. Hello, my dear friends. I'm 73 years old now, sitting here in my small apartment in rural Tennessee, far from the Kingdom Hall, where I once believed I was serving the one true God. My hands shake a little as I tell this story, not from age, but from the weight of what I'm about to share with you. For over a decade, I've carried this burden in silence, watching from afar, as the same corrupt system continues to destroy innocent lives. But today, something inside me says it's time to speak the truth, no matter the consequences. I was born in 1951 in a small farming community where everyone knew everyone else's business. My father worked the tobacco fields and my mother took in laundry to make ends meet. We weren't wealthy, but we had something I thought was precious: faith. When I was 22 years old, two well-dressed men knocked on our door one Saturday morning, carrying leather briefcases and warm smiles. They introduced themselves as Brother Thompson and Brother Williams from the local Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses. They spoke with such conviction about God's plan for humanity, about the coming paradise on earth, about being part of God's chosen organization. My young heart was hungry for purpose, for belonging, for something bigger than the endless cycle of planting and harvesting that defined our small town. The Bible study sessions began that very week. Every Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock sharp, those two brothers would sit at our kitchen table, the same table where my mother served cornbread and sweet tea to anyone who needed a meal. They opened their colorful Watchtower publications and began teaching me what they called the truth. They explained how Jehovah God had chosen their organization as his sole channel of communication on earth. They showed me scripture after scripture, always interpreted through the lens of their literature, always pointing back to the authority of the Watchtower Society. I was mesmerized by their knowledge, their certainty, their promise that I could be part of something eternal and meaningful. Within 6 months, I had stopped attending the Baptist church where I'd been baptized as a child. My parents were heartbroken, but I was convinced I had found the real truth. The brothers explained that sometimes families would be divided by the truth, just as Jesus had prophesied. It was painful, they said, but necessary for salvation. I threw myself into the organization with the passion of a young convert. I attended every meeting, Tuesday night book study, Thursday night theocratic ministry school, and Sunday morning Watchtower study. I spent Saturday mornings going door to door, sharing the good news with neighbors who often slammed doors in my face. But I didn't mind the rejection. I was told it was persecution for righteousness' sake. Every closed door, every angry word, every look of disgust from former friends only confirmed that I was on the right path. The world was controlled by Satan, the brothers explained, and Satan would naturally oppose God's work. The more resistance I faced, the more special I felt. I was one of the few, one of the chosen, one of the enlightened ones who could see through the darkness that blinded everyone else. In 1976, I married Linda, a sweet girl from the neighboring congregation who had been raised in the truth since childhood. Her father was an elder, a man I deeply respected for his knowledge of Scripture and his dedication to the organization. Linda and I had a simple wedding at the Kingdom Hall, followed by a modest reception in the fellowship area. No birthday parties, no Christmas celebrations, no participation in worldly holidays. Our life revolved entirely around the organization's schedule and teachings. We were happy, or at least I thought we were. Looking back now, I realize we were happy in the way prisoners might be happy if they've never known freedom. My zeal for the organization caught the attention of the local elders. They began grooming me for positions of responsibility. First, I became a ministerial servant, helping with sound equipment and literature distribution. Then, in 1981, at the age of 30, I was appointed as an elder, one of the spiritual shepherds responsible for guiding the flock and maintaining the purity of the congregation. I felt like Moses receiving the tablets on Mount Sinai. This was it. I had reached the inner circle of God's organization. As an elder, I was privy to information that ordinary publishers never saw. I attended elders' meetings where we discussed judicial matters, disfellowshipping cases, and organizational policies. I learned about the complex hierarchy that controlled every aspect of our lives. Circuit overseers who visited twice a year to inspect our congregation, district overseers who supervised multiple circuits, and ultimately the governing body in Brooklyn, New York, who were considered the faithful and discreet slave class mentioned in Scripture. Every decision, every interpretation, every policy flowed down from that small group of men who claimed direct communication with Jehovah God. The power I held as an elder was intoxicating at first. People sought my counsel on marriage problems, child-rearing issues, and spiritual difficulties. I formed judicial committees to investigate wrongdoing and decide whether transgressors should be disfellowshipped or merely reproved. I gave talks from the platform about morality, dedication, and loyalty to the organization. Young men looked up to me as a spiritual example. Families invited me to dinner to discuss their teenagers' rebellious attitudes or their doubts about certain teachings. But gradually, small things began to trouble me. I noticed how the organization's teachings had changed over the years, often dramatically. The generation that would see Armageddon had been redefined multiple times. Blood transfusion policies had subtle modifications that weren't well publicized. Dates that had once been proclaimed as divinely revealed truth were quietly abandoned and replaced with new chronologies. When I asked other elders about these changes, they would quote the proverb about light getting brighter and brighter until the perfect day. God was revealing truth progressively, they said. The organization was being refined and corrected by Holy Spirit. I wanted to believe that explanation, but something deep in my conscience kept nagging at me. If God was truly directing this organization, why were there so many course corrections? Why did families suffer for refusing blood transfusions based on policies that later changed? Why were young people discouraged from pursuing higher education in the 1970s, only to have that counsel quietly modified in later years? These questions felt dangerous to even think, let alone voice. Questioning the organization was equivalent to questioning God himself, according to our training. Then came the incident that would change everything. It was a cold February morning in 1993 when I received an urgent phone call from Brother Patterson, the presiding overseer of our congregation. His voice was tense, almost whispering, as he asked me to come to the Kingdom Hall immediately for an emergency elders meeting. Something in his tone made my stomach clench with anxiety. I had been an elder for 12 years by then, and I had never heard him sound so shaken. When I arrived at the Kingdom Hall, I found 3 other elders already gathered in the small library room behind the main auditorium. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on their worried faces. Brother Patterson closed the door carefully and checked to make sure no one else was in the building. Then he pulled out a manila envelope that had arrived in the morning mail, correspondence from the Watchtower Society headquarters that was marked "Confidential, Elders Only." The letter inside that envelope would haunt me for the rest of my life. Brother Patterson's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the official Watchtower letterhead and began reading aloud. The content was a directive from the service department regarding how to handle allegations of child sexual abuse within congregations. But this wasn't the sanitized version that would later appear in public Watchtower articles about protecting children. This was the raw, unfiltered policy that revealed the organization's true priorities. The letter instructed elders to follow a strict protocol when accusations of abuse were brought to their attention. First and foremost, we were told to contact the Society's legal department immediately before taking any other action. Under no circumstances were we to encourage the victims or their families to report the matter to secular authorities. The letter emphasized that doing so could bring reproach upon Jehovah's organization and potentially expose the society to legal liability. We were reminded that Caesar's law was inferior to God's law, and that the two-witness rule from Deuteronomy must be applied to all cases of wrongdoing, including child abuse. What struck me like a physical blow was the cold, calculated tone of the instructions. There was no expression of concern for the victims, no acknowledgement of the trauma these children might be experiencing, no guidance on providing them with professional help or counseling. Instead, the entire focus was on protecting the organization's reputation and limiting its legal exposure. We were told to keep detailed records of all conversations and meetings related to abuse allegations, but these records were to be stored in a separate file and never disclosed to anyone outside the elder body without explicit permission from headquarters. The letter went on to explain the two-witness rule in chilling detail. Unless there were two credible witnesses to the actual act of abuse, or unless the accused person confessed, no judicial action could be taken within the congregation. The elders were instructed to explain to victims and their families that without meeting this biblical standard of evidence, the accused person would be considered innocent in God's eyes and should continue to be treated as a brother in good standing. If the family insisted on reporting the matter to police despite this counsel, they should be warned that such action might be viewed as a lack of trust in Jehovah's arrangements. As Brother Patterson continued reading, I felt a growing sense of nausea. The letter described how to handle situations where accused individuals were prominent members of the congregation or held positions of responsibility. In such cases, extra care should be taken to avoid causing unnecessary disruption to the spiritual well-being of the congregation. The reputation of long-serving elders, ministerial servants, and pioneers was to be given special consideration, as their fall from grace could stumble many others and bring reproach upon God's name. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the section dealing with repeat offenders. The letter acknowledged that some individuals might have a pattern of inappropriate behavior with children, but emphasized that past allegations that didn't meet the two-witness standard couldn't be considered when evaluating new accusations. Each case had to be treated in isolation, even if multiple families had come forward with similar complaints about the same person over many years. The letter explained that this approach was necessary to maintain biblical standards of justice and avoid the appearance of persecution or witch hunts. When Brother Patterson finished reading, the room fell into a heavy silence. I looked around at the faces of men I had served alongside for years, searching for some sign that they shared my horror and disbelief. Brother Matthews, who had 2 young daughters, was staring at his hands. Brother Collins, who had recently been appointed after moving from another state, had gone pale. Brother Jenkins, the oldest elder among us, was nodding slowly as if this all made perfect sense to him. Finally, Brother Patterson spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. He told us that he had received this letter because our congregation had been selected to receive additional training on these sensitive matters. Apparently, there had been an increase in abuse allegations across the country, and the society wanted to ensure that all elder bodies were properly equipped to handle such situations according to their biblical guidelines. He emphasized that the contents of this letter were strictly confidential and must never be discussed with anyone outside the elder body, including our wives. I raised my hand tentatively, feeling like a schoolboy asking a dangerous question. I asked Brother Patterson what we were supposed to do if we personally witnessed signs of abuse, or if a child came to us directly for help. His response chilled me to the bone. He said that our primary obligation was to the organization and to maintaining proper theocratic order. If we had concerns about a specific situation, we should contact the society's legal department for guidance before taking any independent action. Under no circumstances should we allow our emotions or worldly thinking to override the clear direction we had received from God's organization. Brother Collins, still looking shaken, asked what would happen if any of us were subpoenaed to testify in a court case involving abuse allegations. Brother Patterson consulted another document from the envelope and explained that the society had a team of lawyers who specialized in protecting the confidentiality of elder communications. We were instructed to contact headquarters immediately if we received any legal documents and not to cooperate with secular authorities without explicit approval from the society's legal department. The confidentiality of the confessional was sacred, he said, even when it involved protecting criminals. As the meeting concluded, Brother Patterson made each of us promise to keep this information confidential and to follow the outlined procedures without deviation. He reminded us that our appointment as elders was a privilege that could be revoked if we failed to demonstrate proper loyalty to the organization. He also warned us about the dangers of independent thinking and the subtle ways that Satan could use our natural human compassion to lead us away from theocratic principles. I drove home that night in a fog of confusion and moral anguish. Linda was waiting up for me, as she always did when I had late elder meetings. She could see immediately that something was wrong, but when she asked about it, I found myself lying to her for the first time in our marriage. I told her it was just routine organizational business and went to bed without saying another word. But I couldn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying every word of that horrific letter and trying to reconcile what I had heard with everything I thought I knew about God's love and justice. The next few weeks were torture for me. Every time I saw children at the Kingdom Hall, I wondered if any of them were suffering in silence. Every time I gave a talk about trusting in Jehovah's organization, the words felt like ashes in my mouth. I found myself studying the Bible more intently than ever before, searching for some justification for the policies I had been ordered to follow. But the more I read Jesus' words about protecting little children and his harsh condemnation of those who would harm them, the more I realized that something was fundamentally wrong with the organization I had devoted my life to serving. My friends, I want to pause here for a moment because I know this story is difficult to hear. Some of you watching this might be current or former Jehovah's Witnesses yourselves, and these revelations might be painful or shocking. Others might be wondering how anyone could be so naive as to follow such an organization for so many years. But I want you to understand that when you're inside a high-control group like this, your ability to think critically becomes severely compromised. You're taught from the beginning that any doubts or questions are evidence of spiritual weakness or satanic influence. If you're finding comfort in my story, if it's helping you process your own experiences with religious manipulation or abuse, then please know that you're not alone. There are thousands of us who have walked this difficult path, and your pain is valid, your questions are legitimate, and your courage to seek truth is admirable. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Where are you watching from? What brought you to this video? Your story matters just as much as mine, and together we can help others who are still trapped in similar situations. 3 months after receiving that letter, my crisis of conscience reached a breaking point. I was conducting a Bible study with a young father named Michael, whose 8-year-old daughter had begun displaying behavioral problems that suggested possible abuse. When Michael confided his concerns to me and asked for guidance, I found myself at a crossroads that would define the rest of my life. Michael sat across from me in my living room that Tuesday evening, his weathered hands clasped tightly together as he struggled to find the words. He was a hard-working carpenter who had been studying with our congregation for almost 2 years, earnestly preparing for baptism. His wife had died in a car accident when their daughter Emma was just 5 years old, and he had been raising her alone while trying to learn what he believed was God's truth. The transformation in this man had been remarkable to witness. from a broken widower drowning his sorrows in alcohol to a devoted father seeking spiritual guidance for his family. But that night, Michael's usual peaceful demeanor was replaced by a haunted expression that made my stomach turn. He told me that Emma had been staying with his brother-in-law's family on weekends while he worked construction jobs to make ends meet. Recently, she had started having nightmares, wetting the bed again after being potty-trained for years and flinching whenever adult men tried to hug her. She had made some disturbing comments about games that Uncle Robert played with her when no one else was around, games that made her feel scared and dirty. As Michael described his daughter's behavior, every word felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I had read about these warning signs in the confidential letter from headquarters just months earlier. This wasn't speculation or paranoia. This was a textbook case of a child crying out for help in the only way she knew how. My heart broke for this innocent little girl who was being violated by someone she should have been able to trust, and for this devoted father who was turning to me for spiritual guidance in his darkest hour. According to the organization's policies, my path was clear. I was supposed to tell Michael that without two witnesses to the actual abuse, nothing could be done from a spiritual standpoint. I was supposed to discourage him from involving the police because it might bring reproach upon God's name. I was supposed to contact the society's legal department before offering any advice that might create liability for the organization. I was supposed to put the interests of the Watchtower Society above the safety of an 8-year-old child. But as I looked into Michael's desperate eyes, something inside me rebelled against everything I had been trained to do. This wasn't about organizational policies or legal liability or maintaining a good reputation in the community. This was about a precious child who was being hurt by an adult who should have protected her. This was about right and wrong in the most fundamental sense, stripped of all the theological complications and bureaucratic procedures that the organization used to justify its inaction. I took a deep breath and made a decision that would cost me everything but save my soul. I told Michael to take Emma to the hospital immediately to have her examined by professionals who were trained to detect signs of abuse. I gave him the phone number for the local police department and urged him to file a report as soon as possible. I explained that protecting children was more important than any other consideration, and that God would surely want him to use every available resource to keep his daughter safe. The relief in Michael's face was immediate and profound. He had been wrestling with the same moral dilemma that was tearing me apart, wondering how he could reconcile his new faith with his instincts as a father. When I gave him permission to prioritize his daughter's welfare above organizational concerns, it was as if a crushing weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He thanked me with tears streaming down his face and left immediately to take Emma to the emergency room. I knew that my decision would have consequences, but I had underestimated just how swift and severe the organization's response would be. Within 48 hours, Brother Patterson received a phone call from the circuit overseer who had been contacted by someone at headquarters. Apparently, Michael had mentioned during his police interview that he had received counsel from one of the elders, and word had somehow filtered back to the society's legal department. They were not pleased that their carefully crafted policies had been ignored. The emergency elders meeting was called for that Friday evening. This time, the presiding overseer was joined by Brother Harrison, the circuit overseer who had driven down from the state capital specifically to address what he called a serious breach of theocratic protocol. The atmosphere in that small library room was thick with tension and barely contained anger. I could feel the weight of their collective disapproval pressing down on me like a physical force. Brother Harrison was a thin, angular man in his 60s who had been serving as a circuit overseer for over 20 years. He had the kind of authority that came from decades of unquestioned obedience to the organization, and he wielded it like a weapon. He began the meeting by reading selected passages from the Society's correspondence about handling abuse allegations, emphasizing each point with the precision of a prosecuting attorney. His message was clear. I had violated explicit instructions from God's organization and endangered the interests of all Jehovah's Witnesses by my reckless actions. The interrogation that followed was unlike anything I had experienced in my years as an elder. Brother Harrison demanded to know why I had ignored the clear direction from headquarters and taken it upon myself to counsel a Bible study to involve secular authorities. He asked whether I had lost faith in the organization's ability to handle such matters according to biblical principles. He questioned whether I had been influenced by apostate thinking or worldly wisdom that had corrupted my judgment as a spiritual shepherd. I tried to explain that I had acted out of concern for a child's safety, that my conscience would not allow me to follow policies that I believed were morally wrong. But every word I spoke seemed to dig my grave deeper. Brother Harrison's response was swift and brutal. He told me that my conscience was clearly not properly trained by God's word and the organization's publications. A mature Christian, he said, would trust in Jehovah's arrangements, even when they didn't fully understand the wisdom behind them. By placing my personal feelings above the clear direction from the faithful and discreet slave class, I had demonstrated a dangerous spirit of independence that could not be tolerated among the elder body. The other elders in the room watched this confrontation with expressions ranging from sympathy to outright hostility. Brother Matthews, who had always been a close friend, wouldn't even meet my eyes. Brother Collins kept shaking his head as if he couldn't believe how foolish I had been. Brother Jenkins, the old-timer who had served as an elder for over 30 years, finally spoke up to say that he had never seen such blatant disregard for theocratic order in all his years of service. Brother Harrison then delivered what he clearly intended to be the killing blow. He informed me that Michael's actions had created exactly the kind of legal problems that the Society's policies were designed to prevent. The accused brother-in-law was a baptized Jehovah's Witness in another congregation, and his arrest had already generated negative publicity that was bringing reproach upon God's name. Local newspapers were reporting the story with headlines like "Jehovah's Witness charged with child abuse," and the Society's legal department was scrambling to contain the damage. All of this could have been avoided, he said, if I had simply followed the proper procedures and allowed the organization to handle the matter internally. I listened to this litany of accusations with growing horror, not because I feared the consequences for myself, but because I was finally seeing the organization's true priorities with perfect clarity. They were more concerned about negative publicity than about protecting children from predators. They were more worried about legal liability than about justice for victims. They cared more about maintaining their reputation than about following the moral teachings of Jesus Christ, who had said that anyone who harmed a little child would be better off with a millstone tied around their neck and thrown into the sea. When Brother Harrison finished his tirade, he delivered his ultimatum. I could retain my position as an elder only if I acknowledged my error publicly, agreed to undergo additional training on proper theocratic procedures, and promised never again to act independently when dealing with sensitive congregation matters. I would need to contact Michael immediately and instruct him to cooperate with the Society's legal team rather than pursuing his case through secular courts. If I refused these conditions, I would be removed as an elder and marked as someone who had abandoned theocratic thinking in favor of worldly wisdom. The room fell silent as everyone waited for my response. I could feel the weight of 21 years of service to the organization pressing down on me. I thought about all the relationships I would lose, all the privileges I would forfeit, all the certainty and structure that had defined my adult life. I thought about Linda and how this decision would affect her standing in the congregation. I thought about the young men who looked up to me as a spiritual example and the families who trusted my judgment in spiritual matters. But then I thought about Emma, that beautiful 8-year-old girl who had been brave enough to tell her father about the terrible things that were happening to her. I thought about all the other children who might be suffering in silence because the organization's policies prioritized reputation over protection. I thought about Jesus Christ, who had welcomed little children and pronounced harsh judgment on anyone who would cause them harm. And I realized that some things are more important than organizational loyalty, even when that organization claims to speak for God himself. I looked Brother Harrison directly in the eyes and gave him my answer. I told him that I could not and would not instruct Michael to abandon his efforts to protect his daughter. I said that I believed God's love for children was more important than any human organization's reputation, and that I would rather lose my position as an elder than compromise my conscience on such a fundamental moral issue. I stood up, walked out of that room, and never looked back. The announcement came the following Sunday morning during the Watchtower study, delivered in the cold, bureaucratic language that the organization used for all judicial pronouncements. Brother Patterson stood at the podium, his face a mask of practiced solemnity, and spoke the words that would change my life forever. David Miller is no longer serving as an elder in this congregation. No explanation was given, no context provided, just a simple statement that effectively erased 21 years of dedicated service in a single sentence. The reaction in the Kingdom Hall was immediate and profound. I could feel hundreds of eyes turning toward me, some filled with curiosity, others with judgment, many with the kind of cold indifference that Jehovah's Witnesses reserved for those who had fallen from organizational grace. Linda squeezed my hand tightly, her knuckles white with tension, as whispers began to ripple through the audience like wildfire. In the witness culture, losing your position as an elder was tantamount to a public disgrace, a clear signal that something was seriously wrong with your spirituality or your conduct. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in social ostracism and psychological manipulation. People who had invited us to dinner parties for decades suddenly stopped calling. Friends who had confided their deepest struggles to me during my years as an elder now crossed the street to avoid making eye contact. The complex network of relationships that had sustained our lives for over 2 decades began to unravel with surgical precision, as if someone had pulled a single thread and watched the entire fabric come apart. What hurt most was watching Linda struggle with the social consequences of my decision. She had been raised in the organization from birth, and her entire identity was wrapped up in being the wife of a respected elder. Suddenly, she found herself on the periphery of conversations that had once included her, invited to fewer social gatherings, treated with the kind of polite distance that witnesses showed to those whose spirituality was questionable. I could see the pain in her eyes every time we attended meetings, but she stood by me with a loyalty that still brings tears to my eyes today. The pressure from the elder body intensified as word of my rebellion spread to neighboring congregations. Brother Harrison made several more visits, each time accompanied by different local elders who had been tasked with bringing me back into line. They employed every psychological technique in the organization's arsenal: guilt about disappointing Jehovah, fear about losing my eternal salvation, shame about bringing reproach upon God's name, and manipulation through appeals to my love for Linda and concern for her spiritual welfare. During one particularly intense session, Brother Patterson brought along Brother Stevens, an elder from a nearby congregation who was known for his skill at handling difficult situations. Brother Stevens had a grandfatherly appearance that masked a razor-sharp intellect and an absolute commitment to organizational loyalty. He spent 3 hours at my kitchen table, systematically dismantling every argument I made and turning my own words against me with the precision of a trained debater. He began by acknowledging that my motivations had been pure and that my concern for children was commendable. But then he pivoted to the larger picture. explaining how my actions had damaged the organization's ability to help people spiritually. He painted a scenario where negative publicity about Jehovah's Witnesses would prevent interested people from studying the Bible and ultimately cost them their eternal salvation. Was I willing, he asked, to bear responsibility for all those lost souls simply because I had allowed my emotions to override my trust in God's organization? Brother Stevens then shifted to more personal appeals, reminding me of all the good work I had done as an elder, and suggesting that I was throwing away years of faithful service over a single incident. He spoke about the young men I had mentored who were now questioning their own faith because of my example. He described how my rebellion was causing division in the congregation and stumbling weaker members who needed strong spiritual leadership. Every word was calculated to make me feel selfish, short-sighted, and spiritually immature. But the most devastating attack came when he began questioning my motives. Perhaps, he suggested, my real problem wasn't with the organization's policies, but with my own pride and desire for recognition. Maybe I had become too accustomed to being looked up to as a spiritual authority and couldn't handle being corrected by my superiors. He wondered aloud whether I had developed an independent spirit that was preventing me from accepting counsel with the proper humility. His words were like poison, designed to make me doubt my own conscience and question whether my moral convictions were actually character flaws in disguise. Despite the psychological assault, I held firm to my position. I told Brother Stevens that I understood the organization's concerns about reputation and legal liability, but that I could not accept policies that prioritized those interests above child safety. I explained that my study of the Bible had convinced me that Jesus Christ would never have tolerated the systematic protection of child abusers, regardless of the potential consequences for his followers' reputation. I said that if standing up for innocent children meant losing my privileges in the organization, then those privileges weren't worth having. The conversation ended with Brother Stevens making one final offer. If I would publicly apologize for my actions and agree to follow organizational policies without question in the future, they would consider reinstating me as an elder after a period of probation. I would need to contact Michael and urge him to drop his criminal case against the accused brother, explaining that the matter should be handled spiritually rather than through secular courts. If I did this, they promised, the whole incident could be forgotten and my reputation in the congregation could be restored. I asked for time to consider their offer, but I already knew what my answer would be. That evening, I sat with Linda in our small garden behind the house, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. We had planted that garden together during our first year of marriage, and it had become our sanctuary during difficult times. The tomatoes were just beginning to ripen, and the sweet scent of honeysuckle filled the warm summer air. It seemed surreal to be contemplating the end of our life as we had known it in such a peaceful setting. Linda had been unusually quiet during dinner, picking at her food without her usual appetite. Finally, she broke the silence with a question that cut straight to the heart of our dilemma. David, do you really think God wants us to choose between protecting children and staying loyal to his organization? Her voice was small and uncertain, but I could hear the same moral struggle in her words that had been tearing me apart for months. I took her hand and looked into her eyes, those same gentle brown eyes that had captivated me at a circuit assembly 28 years earlier. I told her that I believed God's character was revealed most clearly in Jesus Christ, who had shown nothing but love and protection for children throughout his ministry. I said that any organization that claimed to represent God while systematically covering up child abuse was not truly following Christ's example, regardless of what they called themselves or how many Bible verses they could quote to justify their actions. Linda nodded slowly, tears beginning to form in her eyes. She had been struggling with her own doubts about the organization's policies, particularly regarding their treatment of women and their harsh, shunning practices that had separated her from her own sister years earlier. My crisis of conscience had given her permission to voice concerns that she had been suppressing for years out of fear and conditioned loyalty. We talked late into the night about our future and what it might look like outside the only religious community we had ever known. The prospect was terrifying in many ways. We would be starting over at 57 and 53 years old, with no friends or support system beyond each other. But there was also something liberating about the idea of living according to our own moral convictions, rather than following rules handed down by men in Brooklyn who had never met us and never would. 3 days later, I called Brother Patterson and informed him of my decision. I would not be apologizing for my actions, and I would not be pressuring Michael to drop his case against his daughter's abuser. If that meant losing my standing in the congregation entirely, then so be it. I was prepared to face whatever consequences they deemed appropriate, but I would not compromise my conscience to preserve my position in an organization that I no longer trusted to do what was right. The response was swift and predictable. Within a week, I received notification that a judicial committee had been formed to investigate my conduct and determine whether I should be disfellowshipped for apostasy. The committee consisted of 3 elders from neighboring congregations, men who didn't know me personally and would therefore be able to render an objective judgment about my spiritual condition. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at the Kingdom Hall, where I had served faithfully for over 2 decades. I spent the weekend preparing for what I knew would be my final appearance before a Jehovah's Witness judicial committee. I studied the relevant scriptures about child protection, organized my thoughts about the organization's policies, and tried to prepare myself emotionally for the ordeal ahead. But nothing could have prepared me for the psychological brutality of that final confrontation with the system I had once believed represented God's will on earth. The Judicial Committee meeting took place in the same small library where I had received that devastating letter about abuse policies 2 years earlier. The 3 elders, brothers Wilson, Carter, and Thompson, sat behind the table like judges in a courtroom, their faces stern and unforgiving. I was given a single chair facing them, positioned so that I would feel the full weight of their collective authority and disapproval. Brother Wilson, who served as the committee chairman, began by reading the charges against me. I was accused of causing divisions in the congregation, showing disrespect for the faithful and discreet slave class, promoting worldly thinking over biblical principles, and displaying an independent spirit that threatened the unity of God's organization. Each charge was supported by carefully selected quotations from Watchtower publications that had been written to reinforce organizational loyalty and discourage individual thinking. The hearing that followed was unlike anything I had experienced in my decades of service as an elder. For 3 grueling hours, those 3 men systematically deconstructed my character, my motives, and my spiritual condition with the precision of surgeons and the compassion of executioners. They quoted Watchtower articles about the dangers of independent thinking, cited Bible verses about respecting authority, and painted my actions as the result of pride, rebellion, and satanic influence. Brother Wilson led the interrogation with questions designed to trap me in contradictions or force me to admit that I had lost faith in the organization. He asked whether I still believed that Jehovah's Witnesses were God's chosen people, whether I accepted the governing body as the faithful and discreet slave, and whether I was willing to submit to their authority even when I didn't understand their reasoning. Each question was a minefield where any answer I gave could be used against me. When I tried to explain my position about child protection, Brother Carter interrupted to lecture me about the importance of theocratic order and the dangers of allowing emotions to override spiritual principles. He read passages from organization literature about trusting in Jehovah's arrangements and waiting on him to correct any problems in his own time and way. My concern for children was characterized as worldly thinking that showed a lack of faith in God's ability to handle injustice through his organization. Brother Thompson, the youngest of the three, seemed almost eager to demonstrate his loyalty to the organization by attacking my character with particular venom. He suggested that my real motivation was not protecting children, but gaining attention and feeling important by challenging authority. He questioned whether I had been reading apostate literature or associating with disfellowshipped persons who had corrupted my thinking. He wondered aloud whether my wife had been a negative influence, since women were naturally more emotional and might not understand the need for strict organizational discipline. The most devastating moment came when they brought up Michael and his daughter Emma. Brother Wilson read from a report that had been prepared by the circuit overseer, describing how my counsel had resulted in unnecessary trauma for the congregation and needless persecution of a baptized brother whose guilt had not been established according to biblical standards. They blamed me for encouraging Michael to involve secular authorities instead of trusting in the organization's wisdom and procedures. I felt physically sick as I listened to them twist the facts to make me appear responsible for all the negative consequences while completely ignoring the welfare of an 8-year-old victim. In their version of events, I was the villain who had disrupted the peace and harmony of the congregation by refusing to follow proper procedures. The actual abuse that had traumatized a child was treated as a secondary concern compared to the embarrassment I had caused the organization. When they asked for my final statement, I stood up and spoke from my heart about the Jesus Christ I had come to know through reading the Bible without organizational filters. I talked about his love for children, his protection of the vulnerable, and his harsh condemnation of religious leaders who placed their own interests above the welfare of those they were supposed to serve. I said that if following Christ's example meant being disfellowshipped from their organization, then I would consider it an honor to suffer for doing what was right. The verdict was announced exactly 1 week later during the Thursday evening meeting. Brother Patterson read the brief statement in the same emotionless tone he had used when removing me as an elder. David Miller is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. The congregation received this news in stony silence, but I could feel the weight of their collective judgment pressing down on me like a physical force. In their minds, I had just been sentenced to eternal destruction for rejecting God's earthly organization. The immediate aftermath was even more brutal than I had anticipated. People who had known me for decades now treated me as if I were invisible, looking right through me when our paths crossed in the grocery store or at the gas station. My phone stopped ringing completely, and our mailbox was empty of the social invitations that had once filled our calendar. Linda was treated with the cold politeness reserved for those who were spiritually contaminated by association with a disfellowshipped person. The psychological pressure on Linda was enormous. She was technically allowed to remain married to me, but the organization's literature made it clear that she should limit our association and avoid any activities that might appear to support my rebellious attitude. She was encouraged to increase her meeting attendance and field service hours to demonstrate her loyalty despite her unfortunate domestic situation. Some well-meaning sisters even suggested that she might want to consider separation if I continued to display an unrepentant spirit. But Linda surprised everyone, including me, with her response to this pressure. Instead of distancing herself from me to protect her own standing in the congregation, she began asking her own questions about the organization's treatment of my case. She researched the scriptures I had quoted about child protection and found herself agreeing with my position. Gradually, she came to the same conclusion I had reached, that an organization truly directed by God would never prioritize its reputation over the safety of children. 6 months after my disfellowshipping, Linda made her own decision to leave the organization. She didn't wait for a judicial committee or formal announcement. She simply stopped attending meetings and began the painful process of rebuilding her life outside the only community she had ever known. The cost was enormous for both of us, but especially for her, since she was losing family relationships that went back generations in the organization. The next few years were the most difficult of our lives. We moved to a small town in Tennessee where no one knew our history with Jehovah's Witnesses, and we began the slow process of learning how to live as free individuals rather than as members of a high-control religious group. We had to develop new social skills, form friendships based on genuine affinity rather than shared beliefs, and learn to think for ourselves about moral and spiritual questions. But something beautiful emerged from that painful transition. For the first time in our adult lives, we were able to read the Bible without organizational filters and discover the simple, profound message of God's love that had been obscured by layers of doctrinal complexity and institutional control. We found a small community church where people were encouraged to ask questions, express doubts, and think for themselves about spiritual matters. The contrast with our former religious environment was stark and liberating. Most importantly, we learned that leaving the Jehovah's Witness organization didn't mean losing our relationship with God. In fact, our faith became stronger and more personal than it had ever been when it was mediated through human institutions and filtered through organizational publications. We discovered that we could pray directly to God without following prescribed formulas, worship in ways that felt authentic to us, and serve others out of love rather than obligation. Over the years, we've been contacted by dozens of other former Jehovah's Witnesses who found our story through online support networks and wanted to share their own experiences. Many of them had faced similar moral dilemmas and paid similar prices for following their consciences instead of organizational directives. Their stories convinced us that the problems we had witnessed were not isolated incidents, but part of a systematic pattern of institutional corruption and cover-up. Today, at 73 years old, I have no regrets about the decision I made to protect Emma and challenge the organization's child abuse policies. That little girl, now a grown woman with children of her own, has stayed in contact with us over the years. She was able to heal from her trauma with proper counseling and support, and her abuser was convicted and sentenced to prison. Michael eventually remarried and raised Emma in a loving, stable home, free from the fear and guilt that characterize life in high-control religious groups. The Jehovah's Witness organization continues to struggle with abuse scandals and legal challenges around the world. Their policies have evolved somewhat under pressure from secular authorities, but the fundamental problem remains. They still prioritize their reputation and financial interests over the welfare of abuse victims. Recent court cases have revealed thousands of unreported abuse cases in their internal files, and their resistance to transparency and accountability continues to cause immense suffering for survivors. My dear friends, if you've stayed with me through this long and difficult story, I want you to know how much your attention means to me. Sharing these painful memories isn't easy, but it's necessary if we're going to prevent other families from experiencing the kind of institutional betrayal that nearly destroyed our lives. If you're currently struggling with doubts about your own religious organization, please know that questioning authority is not a sign of spiritual weakness. It's a sign of moral courage. If you're a survivor of religious abuse or someone who has paid a high price for following your conscience, please don't suffer in silence. There are communities of people who understand what you've been through and can offer support as you rebuild your life. Your story matters, your pain is valid, and your courage to seek truth is an inspiration to others who are still trapped in systems of control and manipulation. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Where are you watching from? What brought you to this video? Have you or someone you love struggled with similar issues in religious organizations? Your voice adds to the chorus of survivors who refuse to be silenced, and together we can shine light into the dark corners where institutional abuse thrives. Please subscribe to this channel if these stories are meaningful to you. Hit that notification bell so you'll know when I share more accounts of courage in the face of religious oppression. Most importantly, please share this video with anyone you think might benefit from hearing that they're not alone in their struggles with high-control religious groups. The secret they tried to make me hide was this: that organizations claiming to speak for God are still run by fallible human beings who are capable of terrible moral failures. When those organizations demand unquestioning loyalty and punish those who expose their wrongdoing, they reveal that their true allegiance is to power and control, rather than to the divine principles they claim to represent. But the beautiful truth I've discovered is that losing everything for the sake of conscience can be the beginning of finding something far more valuable: the freedom to love God and serve others according to the deepest convictions of your heart. Thank you for listening to my story, and may you find the courage to follow your own conscience wherever it may lead, even when the cost seems too high to bear. Remember that truth has a way of setting us free, even when it first seems to destroy everything we thought we valued. God's love is bigger than any human institution, and His grace is sufficient for whatever trials we face in our journey toward authentic faith and genuine freedom.